Viewer discretion is advised. He wasn't just dead. He was dressed in a fresh Sunday suit, and someone was still sitting across from him, waiting for their turn to play. Welcome back, Shadow Dwellers. Tonight we have 3 disturbing Appalachian Mountains horror stories inspired by real events. But make sure you stay for the final tale, because it truly shows how terrifying the human race can be when the violence stops and the games begin. Now, let the nightmare begin. Marlinton, West Virginia sits in a dead zone. You can't use a cell phone here. You can't find a Wi-Fi signal. It sits deep inside the National Radio Quiet Zone, where federal law protects the Green Bank telescope from electronic interference. Silence is the only product they sell. Bill and Martha bought it. They weren't stranded, they were tourists. They drove a 2025 Airstream Atlas, a silver bullet built on a Mercedes chassis. It was 24 feet of luxury. They had spent the last 2 weeks touring the Appalachians, looking for the kind of quiet you can't get in the suburbs. Marlinton looked perfect. They arrived on a Tuesday. Bill found the Pocahontas County Fairgrounds right by the river. It was a massive, flat stretch of grass. It was empty. It was free. In the RV world, they call this boondocking. No hookups, just you and the land. They parked near the back fence facing the mountains. For the first 2 days, it was paradise. Wednesday was perfect. They walked into town. The air smelled like pine and wood smoke. They went to the IGA grocery store to stock up on steaks. The cashier was a nice woman, maybe 60, with bright glasses. She scanned their items and smiled. She asked if they were sticking around for Friday. When Bill nodded, she beamed. She mentioned something called the forecast, with the kind of excitement people usually say for Christmas morning. She didn't explain it, but she acted like it was the highlight of the year. Bill assumed it was a harvest festival. Small towns always have funny names for their fairs. Thursday was even better. They went to the local movie theater, an old opera house converted to show films. The popcorn was cheap. The people were friendly. Before the movie started, Bill overheard 2 men in the row behind them laughing. They were talking about the crowd size for tomorrow. They sounded eager. One man mentioned his brother coming down from Elkins just to see the color. They spoke about it like it was a major sporting event, something the whole family needed to witness. Bill squeezed Martha's hand. He gestured that they should definitely go. It sounded like a major local event. They imagined funnel cakes, bluegrass music, maybe a pumpkin contest. Friday came. The 3rd day. It was a beautiful evening. Around 6 p.m., the fairgrounds woke up. It wasn't a secret meeting, it was a block party. Generators kicked on. Strings of yellow bulbs lit up the trees. A small Ferris wheel started turning against the purple sky. Food trucks pulled onto the grass, opening their windows to sell corn dogs and fried dough. Bill and Martha walked over from their RV. They were excited. The smell of sugar and diesel hung in the air. A local bluegrass band was playing on a wooden stage, banjos playing fast and loud. 300 people filled the grounds. Kids ran around with sticky faces. Parents leaned against trucks, drinking soda and laughing. It was Americana at its finest. Bill won Martha a stuffed bear at a ring toss game. They ate funnel cake. They laughed. It was the most normal, welcoming night of their trip. Then the clock hit 8 p.m. The band didn't stop. They actually played faster. The banjo player leaned into the mic and shouted something to hype up the crowd. Everyone went wild. Bill and Martha clapped too. They were caught up in the energy. Everyone was smiling. Everyone was cheering. It felt like a headlining band was about to come on stage. A man stepped onto the platform. He didn't look like a politician. He looked like a guy who fixed tractors for a living. He wore a heavy canvas coat and muddy boots. He waved to the crowd like a rock star. He shouted something about the winter, asking if they were ready. The crowd roared back in agreement. People were whistling. Kids were jumping up and down. Two men brought a cage onto the stage. The crowd cheered even louder. Inside was a cat, a large orange tabby, a barn king. It was the kind of animal bred to kill mice in the grain silos. It was heavy. It looked confused by the lights. Bill nudged Martha. He shouted over the applause that it must be a raffle. He pointed out how excited everyone looked. The mayor reached into the cage. He grabbed the animal by the scruff of the neck. He lifted it onto a wooden table. The stage lights reflected in the cat's eyes. The mayor picked up a 10-inch butcher knife. He held it up to the lights. The crowd screamed with delight. It was the sound of a touchdown at a high school football game. Bill's smile froze. He stopped clapping. The band kept playing. The banjo was frantic, a high-pitched roll of notes that matched the excitement of the crowd. The motion was fast. The mayor didn't hesitate. He drove the heavy blade down in a single, practiced arc, severing the neck with a wet crunch that instantly released a torrent of dark fluid onto the wood. Bill expected a gasp. He expected shock. Instead, the crowd erupted. A man next to Bill screamed with joy, pumping his fist in the air. He looked like his team had just won the championship. Martha grabbed Bill's arm, her nails digging into his jacket. She tried to say his name, but the noise swallowed her voice. The mayor finished the job. It was messy. It was real. But the atmosphere didn't change. The Ferris wheel kept turning. The kids kept eating their cotton candy, watching the blood flow into the zinc-lined trough with the same excitement they had for the fireworks. It was a celebration. Two other men stepped forward with the trough. They collected the liquid. The mayor leaned over the microphone, grinning. He shouted to the crowd, asking them to look at the results. He pointed to the trough. He gestured to the color. He pointed to the thickness. He announced that it was dark and thick. The crowd cheered again. They were high-fiving each other. The elders in the front row were laughing, pulling out their clipboards and writing down the data while slapping each other on the back. Bill stood there paralyzed. He was the only person not cheering. He realized the truth. It was a forecast. But it wasn't just a grim necessity. It was a sport. The nice lady at the grocery store, the guys at the movie theater, they weren't dreading this. They loved it. They didn't trust the weather apps. They lived in the mountains. And this brutality was their Super Bowl. They were reading the winter in the oxygen levels of the blood, and they were having the time of their lives doing it. The mayor wiped the knife on his jeans and waved again. The band kicked into a grand finale. Bill and Martha panicked. The joy around them felt sick. It felt wrong. They felt like they were losing their minds. They turned and speed-walked back toward the Airstream and left. Appalachian folklore is filled with rituals that predate the country itself. In isolated regions like Pocahontas County, the line between superstition and survival doesn't exist. These communities operate on a logic that the rest of the world forgot centuries ago. To them, reading a winter forecast in the vitals of an animal isn't horror. It is just agriculture. It happens in the quiet zones, in the deep hollows, and in the shadow of the peaks where cell signals can't reach. The mountains are old, and they keep their secrets well. Most travelers pass right by, completely unaware of the blood soaking into the soil just a few yards from the highway. Some places are just different, and some places are best left completely alone. In Marlinton, Survival is a currency paid in blood to the soil. But as we move to Story 2, we find that the mountains aren't the only things demanding a price. We're heading to the Devil's Backbone, where the horror isn't ancient, it's clinical. Because out here you aren't a neighbor or a guest, you're just property of Division 4. September of 1959 brought a silence to the Virginia-Tennessee border that felt heavy enough to break bone. Deep within the George Washington National Forest, along the jagged limestone spine locals called the Devil's Backbone, the world had been encased in glass. A freak ice storm had stripped the heat from the air, coating the trees and the ground in a layer of ice so thick it turned the forest into a single frozen sculpture. Gene and his younger brother, Beau, were trapped inside a windowless trapper's cabin, waiting for the dawn to melt the prison around them. They were men who knew the woods, used to the dark and the cold, but the stillness that night felt wrong. It wasn't just quiet. It was the total absence of life. Midnight marked the beginning of the intrusion. A heavy, wet impact struck the solid oak of the cabin door, a sound like a slab of beef dropped on a butcher's block. It was a noise that didn't belong in a storm. Gene, cleaning his rifle by the wood stove, didn't hesitate. He crossed the room and threw the latch, expecting a bear or a fallen limb. Instead, he found a nightmare standing on the threshold. A man stood on the sheet of ice, illuminated by the dim light of the lantern. He wore no coat, no boots, and no gear. He was dressed only in a thin white t-shirt and dress slacks, his bare feet blue against the freezing slush. He didn't shiver. He didn't look at Gene or the warmth of the fire. He simply stared forward with eyes that looked like broken glass. Gene pulled the stranger inside, his grip sinking into flesh that felt like refrigerated dough. The man offered no resistance. He collapsed onto the floorboards immediately, pulling his knees to his chest in a tight, fetal ball. Gene moved to cover him with a blanket, but a wet, grinding noise stopped him. The stranger had shoved his own fist into his mouth. He wasn't warming his fingers. He was methodically chewing on them. The sound of teeth scraping against knucklebone filled the small room. He gnawed with a mechanical, rhythmic force, tearing through the skin until his hand was slick with red, yet his expression never changed. He just stared at the wall, eating himself alive while the brothers watched in paralyzed horror. Exactly 20 minutes later, the second impact hit the door. It was the same dull thud, identical in force and sound to the first. Gene opened it to find a second figure, a near-carbon copy of the first. Same white t-shirt, same slacks, same barefoot stance in the ice. This one, however, wasn't biding his hands. As they dragged him inside, the second man began to convulse, coughing up a thick, viscous gray foam. It bubbled past his lips like industrial sealant, dripping down his chin and pooling on the floor. With his arrival came a smell that instantly overpowered the wood smoke, a sharp, metallic scent of ozone, like the air in the split second after a lightning strike. Gene and Beau realized then that this wasn't just exposure. This was something contagious or chemical. They couldn't stay. The brothers began a frantic scramble to pack their gear. They had to rig a sled and drag these men out to the truck, miles away. They moved with the desperate speed of prey, lashing tarps and gathering supplies, all while the cabin filled with the sounds of the visitors. The rhythmic crunching of the first man's teeth and the wet, bubbling gasps of the second created a symphony of agony that seemed to stretch time itself. For 15 minutes, the visitors remained locked in their loops of torment. The first man continued to destroy his hand. The second continued to drown in the gray foam. Then, at the exact 15-minute mark, the cabin went silent. It happened instantaneously. There was no gradual fading of breath, no slowing of the chewing. Both men went limp at the precise same second, their bodies shutting down as if a power cord had been yanked from a wall socket. One moment they were thrashing in their specific hells. The next, they were just static objects on the floor. Gene approached the body of the knuckle-biter first. He knelt to check for a pulse, needing to confirm what he already knew. He placed his fingers against the cold skin behind the man's ear, but instead of the soft depression of the neck, he felt something hard and metallic. He tilted the head forward into the lantern light. Stapled directly into the skin behind the ear was a heavy metal tag. It was an industrial rivet, identical to the ones used by wildlife officers to track apex predators. The skin around the metal was angry and inflamed, suggesting it had been punched in recently. Gene leaned closer, squinting at the tiny stamped lettering on the tag. It bore no name, no medical alert, no identification of any human kind. It carried only a 12-digit serial number and a chilling possessive phrase, property of division. 4. Do not remove. A check of the second body revealed the exact same tag, in the exact same location. The brothers sat with the bodies until dawn, the smell of ozone lingering in their clothes. When the sun softened the ice enough to move, they hiked out and drove straight to the authorities. But the local sheriff was quickly pushed aside. Within the hour, unmarked black SUVs arrived, carrying men in specialized gray suits who moved with military precision. They collected the bodies without a word. When Gene attempted to point out the tags, to explain the synchronized death and the strange behavior, the official in charge simply stared him down. The narrative was set before the bodies were even in the bags. These were lost hikers who had succumbed to hypothermia. The gray foam, the self-cannibalism, and the serial numbers stapled into their skulls were details that would never make it into any report. Gene and Bo were left with a warning to let the memory die with the storm. But some things cannot be forgotten. They spent the rest of their lives wondering about the nature of a government division that labeled human beings as property, and what kind of test required two men to be turned off like machines in the middle of a frozen wilderness. Division 4 can turn a human life off like a machine and bury the truth in an unmarked bag. But as we move into our third and final story, we find a horror that is much more personal. We're going deep into the hollows to visit a hermit named Mr. Homer, who didn't die for a government secret. He died because someone wanted to play one last perfectly clean game. Blaine shifted in the driver's seat, trying to find a truce between his stiff lower back and the ruined suspension of the 2011 Crown Victoria. The seat foam had collapsed years ago, leaving him sitting on metal springs that dug into his hips. Every pothole on the gravel service road sent a jarring shock up his spine. He checked the dashboard clock. 2:47 p.m. He was 20 minutes overtime, and a dull headache was tightening behind his eyes like a rusted vice. Welfare checks were usually a massive waste of county gas, especially out here in the deep Appalachians. You drive 40 minutes out of town, wrestle the cruiser up a washed-out logging road, and usually find an old-timer who simply forgot to pay his phone bill or got too drunk to walk to the general store. Blaine grabbed his lukewarm coffee from the cup holder. It tasted like burnt plastic, but he swallowed it anyway. Mr. Homer was the target today. He was a hermit in the truest sense, a man who had evaporated from modern society decades ago. The guys at the station joked that he was part of the landscape, distinct as the moss or the gray rocks jutting out of the hills. He hadn't been seen in town for 3 weeks. Usually, Mr. Homer came down every Friday like clockwork to buy 3 cans of Spam, a bag of flour, and a pouch of tobacco. 3 missed Fridays was a pattern. Blaine didn't like patterns. Patterns usually meant something had broken. Gravel crunched loudly under the tires as he finally crested the ridge. The trees were thick here, blocking out most of the afternoon sun and casting long, spindly shadows across the hood of the car. It felt later than it was, the light possessing a strange, washed-out quality. He killed the engine. Most welfare checks came with a natural soundtrack, a barking dog, a generator sputtering, or just the wind moving through the pines. This place had none of that. It felt like a vacuum. The stillness was heavy, pressing against his eardrums. Blaine stepped out, his boots sinking into the soft, damp earth. He adjusted his belt, feeling the familiar weight of his radio and sidearm against his hip. He looked up at the cabin. He expected a wreck. Every hermit cabin he'd ever visited was a disaster zone. Piles of old newspapers, rusted car parts in the yard, maybe a perimeter of trash. But this was different. The yard was raked, not just clean, but manicured. There wasn't a single leaf on the front porch. The windows, usually caked in decades of grime, were sparkling clean. They reflected the trees so perfectly, it looked like a dark mirror, distorting the reflection of Blaine's cruiser. Blaine approached the door. The atmosphere was too heavy to call out into. He walked up the wooden steps. They didn't creak. Someone had oiled them recently. He reached for the screen door, expecting it to be locked or jammed shut by rust. It swung open silently on greased hinges. He rapped his knuckles hard against the heavy oak door. The force of the impact pushed the door inward. It was unlatched. That was when the smell assaulted him. It wasn't the smell of death. Blaine knew that smell. Sweet, heavy, rot. This was the opposite. It smelled like a public pool, chlorine, bleach, industrial cleaner. It was so strong it made his eyes water instantly, stinging his nostrils with a chemical burn. He pulled his collar up over his nose and pushed the door open with his boot, his hand drifting instinctively to his holster. He stepped inside, scanning the room for threats. The interior was impossible. This was a cabin that had stood in these woods for 40 years, with no electricity and a wood stove for heat. It should have been covered in soot and dust, but the floorboards were bleached white, scrubbed so hard the wood grain was raising up. The walls were spotless. There wasn't a spider web in the corners. There wasn't a speck of ash in the fireplace. It looked like an operating room made of timber. Blaine moved deeper into the room. His boots squeaked on the chemically cleaned floor, the sound echoing in the emptiness. To his left, the small kitchen table was bare. No plates, no cups, just the overpowering scent of bleach burning his throat. Then he saw the rocking chair. It was facing the cold fireplace. A figure was sitting in it, perfectly still. Blaine moved around to the side to get a better view, his hand tight on the grip of his weapon. Mr. Homer was dead. That much was obvious, but he didn't look like a hermit anymore. He was wearing a suit, a black wool 3-piece suit. It wasn't some moth-eaten thing from a thrift store either. It was tailored. It fit his gaunt shoulders perfectly. His white hair was combed back with oil. His hands were folded neatly in his lap. Blaine got closer. The skin was wrong. It was pale, waxy, almost translucent. There was no blood, not on the chair, not on the floor, not on the suit. Blaine reached out with 2 fingers to check for a pulse at the neck, expecting the rigid, ice-cold touch of a corpse that had been sitting there for days. But the flesh was warm. Blaine recoiled, his breath hitching. It wasn't the fading warmth of a recent passing. This was radiant heat. He touched the sleeve of the wool suit. It was toasty. It felt like it had been pulled out of a dryer seconds before he walked in the door. Blaine drew his gun. The quiet of the woods suddenly felt aggressive, like someone was holding their breath right behind him. If the suit was warm, someone had dressed him recently. Someone had put this suit on a corpse, combed his hair, and sat him in this chair. He spun toward the back bedroom, weapon raised. He cleared the bedroom in silence. Empty. The bed was made with military precision. He checked under the bed. Nothing. He checked the closet. Empty. He went back to the main room, gun raised. He needed to secure the scene. He approached the body again, needing to find something, an ID, a cause of death, anything to explain the impossible cleanliness. He reached into the inside pocket of the suit jacket. His fingers brushed against a small, crisp piece of paper. He pulled it out. It was a scrap torn from a lined notebook. On it was a simple grid, a game of tic-tac-toe. Blaine stared at it, the bleach fumes making his head spin. It wasn't just a doodle. It was the players that froze his blood. The X's were drawn in thick, heavy black marker. The strokes were aggressive, confident, pressing deep into the paper. The O's were different. They were drawn in faint, shaky pencil. The lead was barely visible, the circles wobbly and weak. Blaine looked at the game. The X had won. A diagonal line slashed through the center, drawn with that same heavy black marker. He looked at Mr. Homer's hands. There was no graphite on his fingers, no pencil in the pocket, no marker in the room. Blaine backed away. The implication hit him harder than the smell of the chemicals. This wasn't a robbery. This wasn't a random killing. Someone had sat here. In this bleaching, sterile room. They had sat opposite Mr. Homer, and they had played a game with him. One person terrified, shaking, holding a pencil they could barely grip. The other person calm, confident, wielding a heavy marker. Blaine felt exposed. The windows were too big. The woods were too quiet. He holstered his weapon, grabbed his radio, and backed out of the door, never taking his eyes off the man in the Sunday suit. He didn't run, but he walked fast. He got to the cruiser, jumped in, and locked the doors. He didn't radio it in until he was 2 miles down the road. State police took over the investigation. They listed the death as natural causes. They never mentioned the bleach. They never mentioned the warm suit. But the image on that paper stuck with Blaine. It kept him up at night. Why would a killer play a game? Why clean the house to perfection but leave that one scrap of paper in the pocket? It was a message. Mr. Homer didn't die alone. He died with an audience, a companion, someone who took the time to wash the floors, dress the body, and play one final round while they waited for the end. And the scariest part wasn't the body. It was the timing. The suit was warm, the paper was crisp, which meant the person holding the black marker had just put the pen down when Blaine walked up the steps. They were probably watching him from the tree line, waiting to see if he wanted to play next. The Appalachian peaks hold secrets that even the authorities are afraid to write down. But the silence in these hollows is never truly empty. It's just waiting for the next player to walk into the trees. If you aren't ready for the lights just yet, click the video on your screen right now for more true Appalachian horror. I'm the Shadowteller. Stay safe in the dark.